And, I'm just willing to say, like, I'm gay or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm willing to say, okay, I'm not going to uphold, like, that homosexuality is, like, just healthy and great and, positive and everybody's got to embrace it. Because, it's kind of a miserable sexual subculture in which people are strangely antisocial. Like, in other words, the Stalinist line on homosexuality, that it's like narcissistic and antisocial, and there's a kernel of truth to it. Of course there is. There is. Right? And so it's not like, it's not like I'm going to say, oh, well, it's good. I'm just going to say, should people, like, attack other people in civil society, and should the state arrest and abuse people on the basis of their deviant sexuality? In other words, I'm not going to say it's not deviant.
Right. But I would just say,
It
as
is
a
deviant, and maybe it is antisocial, and maybe I did fail in my social responsibility to not be heterosexual and have children. I mean, fuck.
okay,
I mean,
okay, maybe you did, and
maybe. I'm just willing to admit.
I want to tell you, as a
rationality to it. I'm not
as a divorced heterosexual man. I want to tell you.
You want to take a walk on the gay side now, Doug?
No. I know. I've thought about
that. Happier.
No, yeah, I might be. I might fucking be happier, but. Welcome, Sublation Media viewers. It is the CutroneZone. I'm introducing it, but the real star here is, of course, Chris Cutrone. Chris, congratulations! Your book is out today. We're recording on June 7th, but this will be going up on Friday. People who've pre-ordered, the book will be shipped soon. People who have not ordered yet should go to the link in the description and order. This is The Death of the Millennial Left, Interventions 2006 to 2022. You have another book or two coming out probably either this year or next.
Right.
And I'm really glad to start making you into a regular YouTuber. It's a fall. You're falling from your perch into the YouTube universe. But I'm glad you're here.
Great.
But yeah, so before I pressed record, I was talking to you about how I have become sometimes frustrated with people, even people who support me on Patreon or people who watch regularly on the YouTube channel, at their reaction to the content, the things I've been saying, either on Twitter or in podcasts or in Critical Cuts videos.
Mm-hmm.
The way in which people want to reject the notion, I think that they want to reject the notion that anything has changed. There's a certain tendency to cling to an older critique of corporate media as opposed to taking in the fact that we're dealing with some sort of hybrid of the corporate world and the state. And
part of that obviously is the problem with Marxism, meaning quote unquote Marxism, right? So quote unquote Marxism, you have to find like a material economic basis for everything.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's not really how it works. In other words, there is a certain autonomy of politics. The problem of capitalism is much more of a general condition, and it's a condition for both economics and politics. So it's not like the material condition for the economic system, it's not like the economic system is that material condition. It isn't, right? And so, I always like to say that there's a more general, critique of society, and economics and politics are just phenomenal forms of that contradiction, social contradiction, what people used to say, social contradiction. I mean, there are so many layers to this, Doug. So like class interest, people think that class interest is like the real thing as opposed to a phenomenal form of a social contradiction. Mm-hmm. And, Marx couldn't have been more clear about this. And yet, people read what they want to read into things. They hear what they want to hear. They believe what they want to believe. And they understand what they want to understand. In other words, it's hard to really challenge people on that basis. And so I think that, like, when I think that there was this kind of complacent idea on the left, maybe going back to the 1930s, that like there's vested economic interests in politics as practiced. And so it's like corporate control of the state. And it's like, well, yeah, I guess so. But what about the state's control of the corporations? And what about, like, so in other words, it sort of goes back and forth between the political and the economic realm. And so people are looking for, I think that Todd McGowan, I don't know if he said this on one of your podcasts, he said something like the left doesn't need an enemy. Like the right needs an enemy, the left doesn't really need an enemy. And I thought that's a really interesting observation, because actually that's one of the problems with the left, is that it's always looking for an enemy or the enemy. And it's kind of like, well, but no, we're out to change society. And in a sense, there are many enemies. And in another sense, there are no enemies. And so this whole like Carl Schmitt kind of friend and foe, enemy friend kind of thing is just like really awful. I mean, he supported fascism for a reason. That's just not the way Marxism approaches socialism.
Right.
And so we're interested in transforming society in the interests of everyone, really, whether they know it or not. And and obviously the point is for them to know it, right? It's not like to do it behind their back or something. It's not going to be like some kind of a swindle, but it's also not going to be about like defeating the enemy. And there's just a long history of this, like 1930s Stalinism, Popular Front era, like which side are you on, comrade? And then later we get like the Maoist Cultural Revolution kind of thing, which has its roots in the 30s, that the enemy is in your head, like the self-criticism, like the inner bourgeois or something is the enemy that has to be destroyed.
Very culty kind of.
Yeah, but it was a mass movement, millions of
know.
people participated in this. And there are varieties of this, like, your ego is your enemy, the ego death stuff, the Lacanian stuff. And it's just like, an ideology, bourgeois ideology is like the false consciousness. It's like Scientology. Like, what is it? The aliens that take over the brain.
Yeah, right.
And
yeah,
you have
yeah.
to like go through stages of getting rid of the alien that's controlling you. And it's like, no, sorry, that's not what we're doing here.
Do you remember the British literary movement called the Angry Young Men? One of them was a guy he got lumped in. This guy named Colin Wilson. And he started out writing The Outsider and kind of doing this analysis of the outsider in Western thought. And he ended up like writing these conspiracy books about how there were alien forces encircling the earth, keeping us repressed, and like some sort of either extra dimensional or alien
that
entity.
Would be fucking awesome, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But the problem is, the miserable problem is that it's much more prosaic, which is that we just have to work through
right.
our kind of social reality. It's just it's strange. So anyway, like getting back to it, like corporate media, it's like, well, what the hell is that, and who is that? And the right wing has its own version of that, which is like, oh, the corporate media is like liberal, or like the media is liberal bias, or this kind of thing. And then they try to trace it to like, I don't know, it's academia is responsible for the bias of the media. It's training people in all this crypto leftism, and again, everybody's looking for an enemy. And it's like, it makes sense at a phenomenal level. These things are plausible. And maybe the enemy is like the reptilians in the hollow earth or something, right? We're like looking for the enemy. And it's kind of like, well, wait, what if, we're engaged in a collective process of social transformation? And, it is kind of murky, and we are part of the problem we're trying to transform, but also we're the only potential solution to that problem. And it's not about like negating ourselves in some kind of profound way. I mean, for some reason, when I was getting ready to talk to you today, Doug, I was thinking of a student that I had, an African-American student, a Black student at the Art Institute, who was a graduate student and was kind of African-American, meaning he was partially African descent, partially African-American descent. And he was talking to his kind of mentor figures, other Black professors, about how excited he was in my class learning about Marxism. and they were like, well, Marxism is white settler colonial discourse. Right, and they consider themselves leftists. They're not like cultural nationalists, like, you know, people.
When did this happen? This year?
A few years ago,
Yeah.
right around the time of COVID. So I think it was the fall before COVID.
Marxism. I mean, that's not a new.
It's not a new
thought.
idea, but at all, right? And I'm just thinking, okay, so then what? Like this kid who is excited by the ideas that, you know, I'm teaching, right? But reading, you know, he's reading it for himself. Like, you know, like obviously it takes many more hours to read the readings that I have them read than to listen to me in a lecture in court, in the classroom, or engage in dialogue with me. And, you know, it was kind of like, oh, well, don't let yourself be taken over by this white settler colonial discourse, meaning that there's like a material interest in white people's, you know, like Chris Cutrone's a Marxist because he's a white settler, don't you know? And it's like, holy shit, man, you know? And it's kind of like, so again,
what would that material interest be?
That I don't want to like off myself immediately as like a, you know, an invader on someone else's land, and as, you know, the recipient of the benefits of the slave economy, you know, that you know, my existence, the fact that my parents and grandparents like lived and were able to biologically reproduce. I mean, it's really like that. My very existence is evidence. And I talk about this in the book, in The Death of the Millennial Left. It's in Republicans and Riots. It's in that article. That's the climax of the Black Question section of the book. And, you know, that, you know, and people have talked about this, like John McWhorter has talked about this, about like, you know, the wokeness as a new religion, and that's original sin. You can never be purged of original sin. So you have to spend your entire life, you know, paying penance for it. But really, you know, your existence is an outrage against the generations of oppressed and exploited and exterminated, genocided people. And, you know, I guess that's true. Like my existence is like due in some way to wiping out the Native Americans, enslaving Africans, and all these things. You know, but, you know, what we're not going to undo that history, right? So
yeah, I have a little anecdote. I don't know if I've told you this before, but when my grandfather was a pilot in World War II, and he never saw combat because after he got trained, he was about to be deployed when they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And my aunt and uncle raised their family in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And I recall visiting them during a I don't know, like the 40th year anniversary of the city or something, because it was built. Oak Ridge was built to help develop the nuclear bomb.
I see. Yeah.
Okay. Right. And
Just
so
the Manhattan Project.
Yeah,
stuff,
it was sister to Los Alamos, and so I visited them, and the story I was told by my aunt and uncle was I should be grateful for the nuclear bomb, because if it hadn't been dropped, there's a good chance my grandfather wouldn't have survived the war, and none of us
wouldn't have been born.
Right. And then so that in their mind justified, you know, like it was necessary to create peace and to bring Japan to be, you know, to surrender. All that did for me was make me think, oh man, I'm the product of this atrocity. I'm, you know, I owe my existence to this atrocity.
Right. So that's bottomless, right? So in other words, like, obviously that has nothing to do with Marxism, but, you know, I always like to say, and it makes people angry, Mao celebrated the nuking of Japan. Right. It's just a fact, right? Stalin and Mao were happy that the U.S. nuked Japan. They celebrated. They did, like, actually celebrated, the communists in China, because why wouldn't they? I mean, Japan had totally raped China in a profound way. Why would they not have celebrated the nuking of Japan? Now, that doesn't mean that they were exactly right to do that, right? Because obviously, like, socialists would not be in favor of nuclear weapons and their use. So, but again, the idea being, that it was more like a forward-looking struggle, right, rather than a kind of, you know, um, guilt kind of politics or something. And it, again, just to recall that now, I'm not trying to whitewash the fact that the nuking of Japan might have been a war crime. Might have been a war crime. I'm not willing to just say it was a war crime. It might have been. It might not have been. But anyway, it's done. It's happened, right? And so the thing is, what are we going to do now, right? The world that was created through all sorts of atrocities and oppression and exploitation, that is our world. Where are we taking it now? What was all that suffering for? And again, that's really the theme of the Republicans and Riots, is that, are we going to be morbid about it? Are we going to negate our own life? Which happens on both sides. So it's not like, okay, only white people are guilty for their existence. But I think the Afro-pessimism and the Black nihilism also has something of this, which is the kind of like, just pessimism about one's own existence, and the idea that one's existence is like a living heritage of an atrocity, slavery, rather than, fuck that, we're fighting now, right? We're struggling now for freedom. And, as Thomas Jefferson said, the world belongs to the living. As Frantz Fanon said, I am not the slave of the enslavement of my ancestors. Right. And so, but we're obviously living in a very pessimistic time. And that's one of the points, is that a lot of the left is actually expressing a right-wing ideology. And right-wing ideology is, by its very nature, pessimistic. Pessimistic about possibilities for society, for humanity. Right. And so it does seem like, if you say, well, what matters is the struggle for socialism, that just sounds like a Pollyanna-ish on the, like, oh, well, or some kind of whitewash or some kind of expression of privilege. Like, oh, it's all well and good, that Chris Cutrone wants to emphasize the struggle for socialism, but what about harm reduction right now? Right? And it's like, actually, we're not in a position to do much about that right now. Not to say that there shouldn't be something done, but are we in the position to do that, or are we only in the position of being held hostage by capitalist politics in the name of a harm reduction that isn't really going to happen anyway?
Right.
And that's going to sound very pessimistic. And it's like, obviously some harms can be averted, some harms can be stopped, but also those involve other harms, right? So an understanding of capitalism is that it's contradictory. Meaning that, it's an old Marxist idea. It's like Rosa Luxemburg's idea, but others, Kautsky, Lenin, Trotsky, the reforms that are achieved actually make capitalism worse. And they produce other kinds of suffering. And again, maybe not immediately, but long term. Right. And so, this idea that we're going to deal with the, the immediacy of, like, that's actually what keeps capitalism going. And so, there is a kind of historical view that we have to keep in mind. And this is a moment for that. Like, one of the points of me publishing these books at this point is to say, this is a moment of taking a pause and looking back and reflecting and saying, okay, where have we been? Where have we come from? Where are we going? Where are we right now? I think one of the first essays in the book, it's a dialogue with the anarchists. And I say, it's really a matter of when we are now, right? Historically, when we are, rather than where we are in terms of this or that locus of struggle, this or that issue, that's going to capture our attention through clickbait media exploitation, right? What we're supposed to care about. That people forget that the only reason why anything's on the internet is to make a profit off you, to exploit you.
I want to tell you what how I'm receiving what you're saying, like what I'm thinking about. Like, the first thing I thought about Well, I'm gonna say it in reverse order because
Okay.
uh, when I have started, since I have started to really focus on trying to organize against the international effort to combat disinformation, right,
Mhm.
as a way to overturn in the United States a very uh, strong and expansive protection of speech through the First Amendment. I think it's probably the most protection any citizen in the world
Any
can
country, yeah.
achieve
Yep.
is being an
Right.
American citizen and having First Amendment protection, um, and trying to stand up as an American to protect that right. Um, I don't have anything to offer a left that wants to ameliorate or mitigate immediate harm when I do that. I'm not saying if we stop the censorship of our everyday discourse in the press, that will mean we will slow down the war in Ukraine, or that
No,
will
people
mean
freaked out when Elon Musk took over Twitter because they were like, how many people is this going to harm to remove the Twitter controls? Right? It was like that was the discourse. The discourse was like how much immediate harm is this going to cause people? And it's like, maybe, possibly. It's not like you can discount that a priori. I mean, it's a little bit
I
paranoid to start,
mean, it's a
but
if you abide by Mill and
Mhm.
Mill's harm principle, then you just do discount that kind of
Oh,
knock-on effect.
sure. Right, right. That's a different way of evaluating it, though, isn't it? Like what they
Right.
meant was, is this going to like cause an increase? I think our last video, there was some YouTube commentary back and forth between me and a viewer about like, you know, isn't censorship necessary? Isn't some reform of like communication policies necessary for something like harm reduction, like harassment, right? Basically, like, shouldn't there be rules against harassment? And it's like, well, harassment's already kind of a legal category. The state already has that. There's like cyber stalking, and it's already illegal to do this and that,
Mhm.
to dox people and whatever. And it's not like, Twitter needs any special policies to deal with that, right?
Right.
And so then it becomes this kind of like, harming people in their heads or something. Like, is it harmful for someone to read something or see something or
Right.
hear something? And it's like, we talked about this last time. It might be, it might be. I mean, this is where I'm sympathetic to the snowflake criticism, where I'm just like, yeah, like life's hard and traumatic and you got to deal with it. And that's how you grow, like you gotta hear things and read things and see things that are disturbing and that impact you. Are they harming you? I mean, again, I think that there is a sense of we are being exploited by the media. We're being kind of manipulated, like we're being like activated, like there is behavioral psychology that they're
Mhm.
using to like, keep our attention and stoke our narcissism and this kind of stuff. I mean, that's probably harmful. That probably is harmful, but that's not what people mean. People don't mean, should I see all these ads for things that like play on my neuroses and anxieties? They don't mean that. They don't mean stopping that, because they know that that's not going to be stopped.
Mhm.
They mean, can people say things to each other in the public sphere? They don't mean, can advertisers like, work on my brain and drive me crazy? They don't mean that, right?
Mhm.
Because that's obviously far more harmful than anything that anyone might say, anyone might tweet or
Mhm.
post to Facebook or anything else,
Right.
right? And so these things get merged into a kind of paranoid sense of like, well, you got to start somewhere, you got to fight what you can fight. And so the least that we can do is not have like, I don't know, right wingers or I don't know what, turfs, posting things that are, denying my existence or something, and it's kind of like, yeah, I mean, so it's a lot of things are being, and it's clear that, these social issues are being used to excuse corporate and state control. They're
Combined.
Yeah,
corporate and state control, not sometimes one and sometimes the other,
right.
but the combination of them. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And
Yeah.
they've been working together, obviously for a long time. And you can say the corporations have always depended on the state, and the state is already always dependent on corporations. The state has always outsourced functions. In our era, because of the discourse of, like, I don't know, free market, kind of neoliberal, whatever,
Mhm.
it adds a layer of, like, something to, like, the paranoid kind of character of it. um and what you were saying earlier, like, when we were younger, the discourse was that of the 60s, and it was about, like, I don't know, that the Vietnam War. I mean, do you remember this, Doug? The Vietnam War was conducted because Lady Bird Johnson, LBJ's wife, had a monetary interest in the helicopter manufacturing company. And then there were, like, other people that's like DuPont, right? And, like, they actually did, like, protest corporations' presence on campus, like the student movement, because it's like they manufacture napalm. And so the idea is that, well, the US is fighting the war in Vietnam in order to buy helicopters and Agent Orange and napalm. And it's like, that's not why the US is fighting in Vietnam. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
come on, um, that's just not the reason. Does it grease the wheels? Does it affect policy in subtle ways? Sure, but the war is being fought for political reasons. Like, the reasons that they give you are the reasons, actually,
Right.
right? They tell you why they're doing it, and it's kind of like you don't want to believe them because you're just like, wait, is that a sound rationale? The domino
Right.
theory, and maybe that. And so it's kind of, well, what's the real reason? And it's like, actually, there is no, like, real reason that's not immediately apparent.
I mean, I think things are somewhat determined by, like, the problems that arise are determined by the economic system and the history of how that's been worked out.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
concretely, yeah.
So then you're a politician and you have to decide, how do I, like, for instance, this
Yeah,
war on disinformation. The society is not functioning well. There was a massive economic crisis. There's a lot of social crises and cultural crises. There was a populist uprising that actually put a candidate forward that none of us wanted, who got elected anyway. He is, an off the cuff, uh, kind of barbarian. Um, and so obviously, this kind of political organizing has to be stopped. Look at QAnon. And so then you have a set of options in front of you. You might have the libertarian option, which would be, what we need is to break up the monopoly power and unleash free competition in the market. And or you might have the progressive left position, which is, oh well, we need to regulate and control disinformation and remove bad actors from the stage, deplatforming, but done by the state. And there are other possible political responses that you can have, but by and large, there's sort of a limited array, and it's to try to address a problem that, if you can't get to the roots of it, you're just going to go through the menu again and
we're in
again.
a position, right, of basically watching the train wreck in slow motion.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, we're sort of condemned to the role of being uh, observers, spectators to the catastrophe. And, of course, we might feel like, okay, we'd like one thing to happen rather than another thing to happen. But really, we're sort of a captive audience to this disaster. And I think that really, the left, right,
Mm-hmm.
or those of us, um, and even intellectuals who are closer to the corridors of power can instantly find themselves on the outside, can sort of instantly find themselves in a position of being an observer of the train wreck, right, and feel kind of helpless about what's going on and about what's going wrong. And I think that you know at a basic level, we have to remind ourselves that our feelings don't affect anything, right? And so it's kind of like, again, the very hard thing that I had to do around Trump. I talk about it in the preface to my book,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is that I'm just like, okay, I can't stop this from happening. So what am I going to do?
Mm-hmm.
Right? How am I going to deal with this? And, you know, I can contort myself one way or I can contort myself another way. And what are my purposes? What's the point? Right? And, it's very tricky, I think, because I think that, you know, like talking about something and sort of trying to normalize it, because remember how much it was don't normalize Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, actually, you have to normalize it because you have to be non-hysterical about it. And you have to sort of see it within a larger context. And even though it's shocking to people, I mean, people care about various things. And like industry insiders obviously care about very minimal things. It's basically a taste community for them. And so, the sort of media political complex, we might say,
Mm-hmm.
can feel very strongly about things that, from a socialist perspective, are not really any differences at all. But they can feel like everything hinges on this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything hinges on the particular red that's used in a Coca-Cola billboard advertisement. Like people care about these things. They're like, no, you got to use this red and not that red.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel like Trump, is just whatever. And I think we've talked about this before. I'm from New York, and so I'm like, holy shit, is this possible? So I knew I was familiar with Trump as like a figure before he became like the reality TV star, The Apprentice, which I didn't really watch because who cares
Mm-hmm.
about people who want to be, I don't know, corporate toadies? I mean, what is that
Yeah.
show even about? Do you know? Like, I mean, it's like, you know, and so I just was like, okay, well, what? And then it's like, okay, this is happening. And so what am I going to do about it? And what do I need? Like getting down to basics. Because
Mm-hmm.
I remembered like, oh, Ronald Reagan is like a B movie star, you know, and the fact that he's like a superficial kind of guy lent a kind of sinister character to the whole thing. And I'm like, okay, they're gonna kind of do that. And he is this loudmouth, like whatever, who's said various things that are racist and sexist and whatever. He seems to have been pretty gentle on the gays over the years,
Mm-hmm.
right? So not so much a homophobe, although he was willing to pander to the
Christian
homophobic.
right.
Yeah, and whether the Christian right are particularly homophobic is another question. There are probably worse homophobes in the world than Christians,
Mm-hmm.
like than believers. There are probably like secular atheist homophobes who are worse than the Christians. Who are willing to love the sinner and hate the sin at least.
Right.
Whereas I feel like a kind of science person who's homophobic just wants to like kill you. Like like it's like this is
Just a little bit of psychosurgery, you'll be fine, Chris.
exactly right. Like exactly right. It's like an evolutionary disadvantage that needs to be corrected.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, exactly. So I just felt like okay, what are we gonna do? And I was very, in a sense, cautious and careful about what I said and what I didn't say about Trump, because I was like aware of like, okay, I'm not going to get into the weeds on this or that, but it sort of stands like it's pretty good after all these years by why not Trump. I kind of talked about mendacity of the status quo, and Trump's lies are instructive because they tell the truth about ideology in a way that the lies of the status quo kind of confuse you and you know render things very murky, and that really we're finding ourselves in a remarkable position that maybe has been there for a long time but is graphically illustrated now, of very little tolerance for any kind of change, even rhetorical change. There's like it's like a brittle environment
Mm-hmm.
where it's like discursive norms have to be preserved because it will cause like devastating harm to like talk the wrong way. I mean, that's like pretty sinister, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, and the Russia thing, the Russia whole thing, you know? Like, I was like, okay, let's say that Trump really does want to be friendly with Russia, which is not particularly clear, right?
Mhm.
It's because with him, it's all triangulation. It's all Kissinger, Nixon type triangulation. And so it's about being friends with everybody and being enemies to everybody. And I'm like, okay, let's say that he wants to be friends with Russia. You know, I don't, you know, it's not like I'd like Putin or Russia. I mean, I think they play a pretty nefarious role in various things in the world. But it's like, you know, is that the worst thing in the world? You know?
No.
And it's got, you know, and I just sort of like said, oh, okay, you know, what kind of change does Trump represent? He doesn't really represent much of a change. He's not even calling for much of a change. It's more of a rhetorical change. And you know, maybe one thing that might be a change is just a shift in foreign policy, which isn't even really, because they did the reset button with Obama. Didn't Hillary go and say, let's hit the reset button with Russia?
Mhm.
Did she bring a red button and said, let's hit the
I
reset?
don't remember that, but that sounds right. I know
Yeah,
that Obama was softer on Russia than most of his critics wanted him to be,
yeah,
including within the Democratic Party.
of course, yeah.
Right. And so being relatively friendly to Russia was not a huge change from the Obama administration, if it had been able to be maintained. But it was not really. Trump ended up arming Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
in other words, they play sides, and then of course everything is exaggerated, and then they claim. I mean, obviously the Republicans and the Democrats accuse each other of things that are just completely not true, and kind of
mhm.
absurdly exaggerated and rhetorical. At the same time, you know, there are these differences that are articulated, but in such a way that is, you know, you can mistake rhetoric for substance.
Well, one of the things you said just a moment ago that I want to go back to because it's on my mind
Mm-hmm.
lately is that you pointed out how the left did not want to normalize
Yes,
Trump. And what that meant was not treating him as a political
an
enemy,
ordinary capitalist politician.
right? But as some sort of emergency, which what that set up was a left that was more than willing, I guess, to go along with the state using its emergency powers granted to it through the
To
war
go
on
after Trump.
terror to go after
I
Trump.
remember
Yeah.
there was a platypus member who got very angry at me when I said, you know, Trump's right. They wiretapped Trump Tower. You know, Obama wiretapped Trump in during the election. He's like, you know, Trump is right, and they got very angry at me. Like, how dare you repeat Trump's lies? And then, of course, it's true. And I was just like, yeah, but you know, you can see it. You can already see it. You can see just in the way that Obama and Clinton were talking about it, and even in what, you know, Trump was saying, and even like the Carter Page stuff, and then the prosecution of Flynn and Manafort. You
They
know,
wiretapped Angela Merkel too. I mean,
oh well, of course they did, right?
right?
Well, right, and you know, and people have been wiretapping. I mean, LBJ wiretapped Nixon,
Right.
and you know, and knew that Nixon was telling the South Vietnamese not to make a peace deal,
Hmm.
right? And like serious stuff. And I think that the Carter administration knew that Reagan was doing the stuff with Iran, saying
Hmm.
don't release the hostages. So
Right.
they were obviously surveilling Reagan, and they just do. They just do, right? And so they do, and so it's kind of like, you know. But again, the accusation was such that what it did was, if you made that accusation, you were basically saying that the exercise of power was illegitimate, and that's what can't be. That's what people can't tolerate. They can't tolerate that, and it's like, well, I mean, it's
Wait,
legitimate
but they
with
can
everything
tolerate it
else,
if
but it's
if a
illegitimate, right?
Republican is in power. They
Right,
can say that.
right, exactly. Then they can say it's illegitimate use of power. If it's a Democrat, then you can't say that. And it's like, but from a socialist perspective, it's all more or less legitimate and illegitimate. Meaning it's legitimate, this is the way the capitalist world works, yes. It's illegitimate. Do we want to accept that? No.
Right.
Right? And not just accept it in terms of like, you know, at a moral, ethical level, but, you know, that socialism will mean doing something very different. It won't mean doing the same thing, but with different policy goals.
Right.
But that's what socialism means now. right? And that's what the
Right.
whole DSA turn has done. It's turned it into, well, which policies do you support? You know, it's like, I think that in the YouTube comment back and forth that I had on our last video, it was like, well, Engels supported the 8-hour day. And it's like, yeah, and Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto supported progressive taxation. Does that mean that progressive taxation is communist? Does that mean that the 8-hour day is socialist? No, it does not mean that. Do you know? But that's what socialism comes to mean. It's like, and then people scour Marx and Engels' writings or Lenin's writings or whoever's writings, and they look for some like endorsement or affirmation of some like capitalist policy. And they're like, see, that's like on our side. See, Marx says so. And it's like, God damn, like that's not what we're doing here. That's not the point, right? The point is to move the world to such a place where we don't need a national security state.
Right.
I mean, there was another instance I was reading. I'm trying to remember what the exact reference is, but it was something like, oh, I don't know if it's Gabriel Rockhill. It's one of these characters, right? And it's like, well, you know, Cuba needs police, right? Like a socialist state needs police. And it's like, okay, but maybe that's an index of it not being a socialist state.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, in other words, it's kind of like, all right, yeah, like maybe the dictatorship of the proletariat, you'll need police for a little while or something.
Yeah.
You'll democratize the police. But like, you can't say, oh, well, socialist countries, you know what it was? It was even worse than that. It was Cedric Johnson. Johnson. He was saying, you can't call for defunding the police or abolishing the police because, look, even a socialist country needs police like Cuba. And I was like, holy shit, no, please don't. Please don't. You know? Right. And that, I mean, that's a perfect example of how, like, supporting Stalinism does lead you back to the Democrats. Or does lead you back to capitalist politics.
Well, right? I mean,
and it's like, but we're trying to move society. In other words, Cuba, okay, Cuba, all right, right? Or like,
does that really? Are we really trying to tell the American public, people, working class people in America, that what we're for is turning the United States into Cuba? Is that what we're saying? You know,
right, Doug? I know we're way down this rabbit hole, and like I said, you know, Cedric Johnson's a nice guy.
I mean,
intelligent guy.
We support Cuba's struggle.
Yeah,
Cuba's struggle. That's one thing.
Or to say
they define what a socialist country is.
Right.
They define what socialism is. That's something completely different.
That's a major concession. Yeah, exactly. You could say, well, it's not a socialist country, and you could also say the U.S. shouldn't be constantly attacking it.
Right, and there maybe is a struggle for socialism there that's ahead of our own. I'll even grant that, right? Maybe, but I'm just
in certain respects, right?
Right, but I'm not going to say, oh yeah, we want the whole world to be run like Cuba, and you know,
and what we want is socialist police. That's what we really want.
Yeah, and we want a socialist police, and we want one man in power for his whole life, and we want
there's that. But
but
just because I feel like it's like you wave a magic wand or something. It's like, again, what we were talking about just a moment ago. The Republicans are in, the state is bad. The Republicans are out, the Democrats are in, the state is good. And it's like, well, wait. The basic function doesn't change, and even the policies don't really change very much. I mean, maybe the targets change, but not really. Not terribly much,
I know I'm being a little too focused on one thing here, maybe, but I have noticed that if you talk about how the American state's policies are Orwellian now, that is
makes you a right winger,
a right wing critique to point to Orwell.
Sure, because Orwell, we know, was already appropriated in the Cold War to be an anti-communist, even though he wasn't, or he was, but he wasn't.
He was an anti-Stalinist, certainly, and maybe his politics weren't,
sound.
And all of the decisions, weren't perfect. But Orwell's 1984 is a critique of totalitarian state power. It's not. Right.
Right. It's not exactly. And, that's why, I think that in one of my pieces, I talk about, in the book, I talk about how it's more like Brave New World than it is like 1984, the totalitarianism that we face now. And in other words, that's actually a more accurate prognosis. Is that everybody's going to be psychopharmacalized, into submission, and and no one's going to want to have sex, and that's how everything will be nice.
Yeah, but there is doublethink.
Well, there is. No, the Orwell stuff is still there. Of course, it's still there. It is very much there. But I feel like they don't even want to bother with doublethink, right? Because doublethink means that you're thinking. They don't want you to be thinking.
Yeah,
right? In other words, it's not like thinking and therefore doublethink is necessary to combat thinking. It's like, actually, the ideal situation is don't think, just obey. And again, this is going to sound like really, far-fetched or something, but we just went through the COVID thing, and
Right.
we've obviously gone through the Trump thing, and you're just not supposed to think certain things. You're just not supposed to. You're not supposed to question. If you question it, what's wrong with you? If you think it, what the fuck is wrong with you?
Right. Yeah. The idea that being skeptical about whether or not the vaccine was going to be efficacious made you right wing.
Within Platypus, I was very unpopular. I'll just say this: within Platypus, I was very unpopular about
within your own
yes
Marxist organization.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I said, the same people who brought us the war on terror and the, all the horrible policies coming out of the Great Recession, we're going to trust those same people to deal with the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. And what did people say to that?
They were like, oh, no, it's totally different. I mean, it really was like, what, Chris, you want people to die? I mean, they went there. They did. Of course they did. And I was like, no, but just remember, this is capitalism still.
Right.
Meaning it's not like the question of capitalism is suspended just because there's a pandemic.
Yeah, right.
It's not, right? And that doesn't mean it's like all bad or something, but it does mean, in other words, like this bullshit medication produced by some state-sponsored pharmaceutical industry, because I think Moderna was even set up by the government.
Right.
Right. And but obviously Pfizer wouldn't exist without all sorts of government contracts. And, that might be the best tool that we have to deal with this virus. But it's a shitty tool. And one of the reasons why it's a shitty tool is, yes, because capitalism. Fuck. And again, it turns you into a hippie to remember that Marxists used to critique how capitalism affects science. This used to be very basic Marxism, that capitalism distorts and holds back and only gives us a very limited and deformed version of science. Right? That capitalism is a limitation on science because it's a limitation on the social conditions in which science can be practiced generally. But then if you add the political layer and the fact that they were using it to get rid of Trump, because they were.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And I mean, I remember Kamala Harris saying because Trump produced the vaccine, she wouldn't trust it.
Right.
And then immediately after she's in office, then it's like, you have to take the vaccine. And if God help me, I'm sorry, forgive me, Doug, but I remember Noam Chomsky and Michael Albert talking with you on a podcast about how you should restrain your child to force them to take the vaccine. And they said that very blasé, because you were saying that your son, I think, was having a kind of...
he is phobic to needles.
Phobic to needles. And they were like, well, can't you restrain him and do it anyway? And I was just like, do you know what I mean? And
right. No, and I like, you know what? Yeah, I know. And I was like,
anarchists.
I know. And I was like, well, in fact, no, he's too big for me to restrain. And the hospital won't do that.
No, they're not going to knock you out to give you a vaccine. Of course not, because the risk of being knocked out is much greater than the risk of being anesthetized is a serious thing. And so no, but these are anarchists.
Well, look, I chalk that up to them both being old men and being afraid of the vaccine.
No, it's also because they're fucking Democrats. It is because they're Democrats. It really is. It's because their anarchism only goes so far. In other words, they do think I mean, it's hard not to think, right? And again, it sounds like you're going into hippie land. You're going into some antinomian counterculture land, or like some caricature of Marcuse or something,
Mm-hmm.
to just be like, actually, it's all fucking rotten, In other words, like, yeah, they're poisoning us all the time. They're poisoning our water, our air, our food. I mean, they are, right? They certainly are. It's like RFK Jr., right, is running for president. And if I'm not mistaken, so he's like a vaccine guy, anti-vaxxer, or whatever, right? But I think he actually achieved a concrete goal, which was to remove a preservative that they used to put in vaccines and that they no longer do.
Uh-huh.
Right? That was actually harming people.
Right.
Right? And it's like, okay, and what? That's not a good reform that he achieved on the because I was watching some CNN thing where it's like, oh well, he gets his craziness. He's able to sell his craziness because of his name recognition, and because of his last name. And I'm like, but it hasn't all been crazy. Like, he actually did achieve a worthwhile reform, which is to get these companies to remove a preservative, which meant that they have to spend more money on other things, something that was harming people in the vaccine that they otherwise would keep in there. And,
at one point during
is that bad?
Yeah, no, I know. At one point during the pandemic, Jimmy Dore and a few other people, and probably some articles were written, but I saw Jimmy Dore talk about, and another YouTuber who's a nurse practitioner and talked about COVID a lot, talk about how when you're getting the vaccine in the United States, they don't give you the shot in the right way. There's they should like make sure they're not going to hit
a
vein,
blood vessel.
Right, because so they should pull back on the needle to see if there's blood in there. If there is, they should do it again.
Intramuscular. Yeah.
Right.
So you shouldn't get your shot from a National Guard person at a stadium. You should get it from like an actual someone who's regularly giving people shots, who knows how to do it, because actually you'll have a much worse reaction if it goes directly into your bloodstream.
Yeah, there's just things that you don't want to have happen if it goes into your bloodstream. Yes, there could be much more severe side effects that way. And
basic stuff
that was not taken up by the mainstream media, and it was
because they didn't want anyone. Right-wing. It turns into a right-wing talking point because they just wanted millions of people to get shots as quickly as possible.
However, which way it is, whether it's in the eye or up their butt, it doesn't matter. They have to get the shots, and just don't think about it. Do as we say,
And that's the reason why they didn't let people who had already been infected avoid getting the vaccine, which European countries did let people use natural immunity. But in the United States, they're like, yeah, we don't want to deal with that. We just want as many people to get the shot as possible. We don't want to like adjudicate who's been sick and who hasn't, who's legitimately, right?
Yeah, it'll be an extra expense to create these tests to see if you've been infected.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, certainly the antibody tests were expensive. That's right.
Right.
Yeah, the antibody tests are more expensive than the antigen tests. And, it's just kind of like, well, at a certain level, you just got to trust people to just, decide to get the shot or not. Fuck it. Especially because they knew that the shot was not going to stop the pandemic, that it was only going to decrease hospitalization, which is, of course, a good thing. Meaning, like, if I can avoid going to the hospital, that's great. And it's not like, oh, yeah, fuck you, I'm going to be hospitalized and make the public eat the expense. Of course, you don't want to be hospitalized, right?
Right.
And so, but really that was the bottom line. The bottom line was don't overwhelm the hospitals. That was always the bottom line. And it's like...
But even there, Chris, it turns out, looking back, if you were under 30...
Right, anyway, right.
Right, it didn't really even do that. And I don't know for a fact what it...
That's right.
It's like neck and neck as to whether the side effects or the COVID was more... likely.
Yeah, I mean, but anyway, they shouldn't have mandated it in the way that they did. And, and also I just think as a public health thing, they just didn't take into account psychology. In other words, like, it's like, if you really wanted people to do one thing rather than another thing, don't lie to them, don't scare them to death, don't threaten them, don't try to coerce them, because probably it's going to be counterproductive.
Call upon their patriotism.
Yeah, do something, or just say, you know what? Yeah, it's an experimental vaccine, and we don't really know, and but it's the best thing
We're
that we
really
have.
pretty sure it will stop you from going to
Yeah,
the hospital. And if you remember, the idea here is to flatten the curve so that we don't overwhelm our medical system. So if you're over 40, definitely go get it. If you have any feeling that you're susceptible, go get it. We're really sure that it's not going to be that bad for the majority of people in terms of side effects, and it's worth the risk because you're helping everybody by doing it.
right.
Something like
And
that.
so, but again, like it's like I think that I think that really what was revealed to me in the
Mm-hmm.
COVID experience was just how authoritarian people are. And by authoritarian, I mean not just trusting authority. I mean conformist, like really, just like witch burning, like
Right.
of any dissent, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously I'm in a blue state. I'm in Chicago. I'm in a major Democrat city. And so, of course, I was a different environment. Probably, there are other issues with being in a red state or something, or being in a Republican kind of stronghold. But, I just feel like, and what's interesting now about Trump, I'll just say this. It might be in an article that I will write on why not Trump again.
Mm-hmm.
Again, why not Trump? Is that, Trump, it's very interesting. He's criticizing DeSantis for being too lax on COVID. I don't know if you caught that.
Yeah, I did.
So the Republicans are complaining that Trump is running to the left of DeSantis.
More authoritarian. On that front.
Well, because he's also criticizing DeSantis for going after Disney, right? Because DeSantis probably is anti-LGBTQ. I mean, a lot of the Republicans are, in a way that Trump is not. But just on a host of issues, like Trump is more moderate than the rest of the Republican field. Again, like before, and last time they said the Republicans complained that he was a Democrat who was trying to do a hostile takeover of the Republican Party, which is true. But the Democrats have to say, and the left is of course willing to say this because they're willing to be the shock troops and the credulous true believers, that Trump is the most right wing of the Republicans. And it's like, no. And actually that's why he's a threat to the Democrats, because he is running to the center. He is competing for the moderate electorate. And so he is going to say, actually, I mean, I think he actually has said New York State did better than Florida on COVID, which is kind of like, and again, the Fox News people are like flabbergasted. They're like, how could he say that? Right. And, but again, so it's one of these things where I feel like that makes Trump worse for the Democrats, also at a rhetorical level, because they see something sinister in that. In other words, they just want everything to be siloed in recognizable form. And they want to divide the electorate like, okay, the Republicans are these libertarian yahoos, and the Democrats are these responsible, social justice, harm reduction people, right? The Republicans are willing to let people die in the name of freedom. The Democrats are willing to curtail freedom to keep people safe, right? And he doesn't really fit that, and that's going to make things more hysteric, I think, around him, and I just feel like, can we just think clearly away from this partisan manipulation and scaremongering and whatnot? And that's been my mission all along, with Trump, because, again, it's kind of like, did I want Trump to happen? Not really. Did I welcome it? Not particularly. But it's kind of like, I can't do anything about it. I can't avoid it. And so what am I going to do now? And am I really going to just hang up my hat? Am I going to say, okay, the Millennial Left, they kind of toyed with Marxism for a few years, but now they're going to check out because of Trump, and I just have to accept that, and I have to kind of go along with it. I have to say, yes, look at how regressive Trump is on this and that. like he's right-wing Supreme Court justices, threat to our freedoms, threat to whatever, and biggest corporate tax break in history, and just everything, right?
That
Like
happens every president comes in and gives another bigger corporate tax cut. I mean, Bill
maybe
Clinton
Obama didn't. I guess Obama didn't do a tax.
did he not? Okay, no, he did. He made it permanent.
Oh,
Didn't
he
he?
did. There was something around. It was some compromise with the Tea Party, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah, it
he
was some
made
John
Bush's
Boehner.
tax cuts permanent.
Permanent. That's
And
right.
in a debt ceiling.
A debt ceiling deal, right?
Right.
And but again, I'm like, I just want to recall. Can we just recall? Socialists used to be against taxes.
Right. Yeah.
Socialists are against taxes. I hate children. I hate to tell you, Marxists are against taxes. Right. In other words, when Marx is talking about a progressive taxation, he's talking about after the revolution.
Right. And
right.
and that's like part of like a critique in the critique of the Gotha program. When he starts talking that way, he's not even being prescriptive. He's pointing out the limits of the Gotha program and what would have to be what they would really mean. And he's not being prescriptive.
Because, it's not like Marxists think that the Republicans are lying. When the Republicans say, well, the rich people never pay taxes anyway, not only because of loopholes, but because they always, whatever taxes they're paying, they pass on that cost to the consumers and the workers.
Right.
Of course, that's true. Right. So it's not like that it's an illusion that you're taxing the rich in order to benefit the poor. It's an illusion. The Republicans are completely correct about that. It's a total illusion. And, but it's also, just in class terms, socialists have to be against every tax that the workers pay. And that consumers pay. Like everything. Sales tax is bad. Even like property tax on your domicile is bad. And, taxing small businesses is bad. It is. And income tax is horrible. Income tax is horrible.
When you okay, I'm going to ask you a question about taxation as a nerdy old Climonite. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
When corporations pay taxes, not individual rich people, but corporations, that is the corporations turning over to the state some of the surplus, right?
Yes.
And they can't use that to reinvest in production, and they can't use that to pay their workers or themselves. And then the state redistributes the surplus, theoretically, sometimes to working people.
They don't really. What they do is they provide the infrastructure that the corporations can't fund themselves. That's what they're really doing. Right. In other words, the corporations, want to have like a different body, like pay for the military and the police, because those are the things that really matter.
Well, Social Security.
Oh, well, that stuff. Yeah, sure. Although that's like highly regressive. I was trying to explain to my partner, who's a new American citizen, about like, he's like, oh, so Social Security is based on your income level before you retire. And I'm like, yes. Right. In other words, like rich people get more from Social Security than poor people get from Social Security. And that was like a shock to him. And I was like, yeah, it's Social Security, meaning it's supposed to help preserve your place. Right. It's not supposed, you know what I mean?
So you lived in poverty your whole life and you'll continue.
You're going to stay in poverty. Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, just trying to explain that. And, so, I mean, taxation at that level, at the level of, I mean, again, from a Marxist perspective, it's also total capital. And then what you'll have is like someone like Adolf Reed, my old mentor, will talk about like the social wage, right? Meaning like not only the stuff you're paid, like not only what you're paid by your employer, but also the general social benefits, like public schools. There's like a social wage, right? And that what the left should want is an increase in the social wage, and what the right wants is to constantly cut the social wage. And it's like, no, right? Because that's a massive concession to like Keynesianism and Fordism. And the problem there is that it sort of sets you up. And then it becomes, well, what is the social wage? And how are we adjudicating that? Because then we're also supposed to follow down the rabbit hole. We're supposed to say, no, parents shouldn't get a voucher from their own taxes to pay for the school of their choice for their children, because somehow that's taking away from the social wage. It's like, well, they've paid the taxes, and then the state's giving it back to them to pay for a school, like a charter school, and that's a net decrease for the social wage. How does that work? And then it becomes, oh, well, it's because the teachers in a private school are not unionized versus the teachers in the public school are unionized, and that's supposed to be a factor in the social wage.
Well,
so
why not just organize
exactly organize the teachers in the private schools, and also don't assume that the public sector unions are somehow a socialist constituency.
Yeah,
because they're not, right? And so again, there's just all.
Oh yeah, well they are if you define socialism as Keynesian statism,
right? And then the right is there to say no, it's just a racket, it's just crony capitalism, it's just vested interests, right? And of course the right is correct about that. In other words, that this is not really socialism. I mean, in other words, the right would say this is not what Marxists.
Well, the right says that the Keynesian, statism is socialism, and that's all it ever has been and ever could be.
But it's
right
for them. It's the only thing that socialism could be. Mm-hmm. But they all are also aware of the fact that that's not what Marxism wanted.
Right. Right.
In other words, for them, I don't know. Well, for them, socialism is just unfree capitalism.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so basically they're like, this is not what Marx wanted. Well, what Marx wanted is not possible anyway. And so that all you have is relatively free capitalism versus unfree capitalism. That's basically, and then they call unfree capitalism socialism. Mm. And we, Marxists, should say they're right, that what people call socialism is just unfree capitalism.
Yeah, I agree. This is something that I've been running up against when it comes to this issue of free speech. And maybe we can stop here and pick it up on how it could be that the free market, the idea of the free market, is not to be just completely overthrown or rejected out of hand by Marxists. It's not like that's the end or the rising of meaning.
Well, the other thing is that you never get rid of the free market anyway. In other words, even in the Soviet Union, there was a black market.
Oh, right.
A huge black market.
Yeah.
A major black market. Right? Yeah. And so you don't get rid of it anyway. You don't. So this whole thing, it's all, like I said, it's all a setup, right? So the right wing says that they're free marketers, and then the left are like, oh, we're against the free market. It's like, have you thought about it? Like, what are you talking about? Right? Or, the other thing that I like to point out, socialists were against minimum wage laws historically. Why? Because they recognize minimum wage.
Can I give a guess? Can I give a guess? All right. Because, well, first of all, it put forward the idea that there was such a thing as a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. So, and because, in fact, the right is correct when they critique minimum wage laws, because the wages as a number are kind of only meaningful in relationship to the whole body of commodities.
Yes.
And so you're not actually going to be, in any long-term way, going to be uplifting anyone up. That you may cause inflation, you could cause capital flight, but you're not actually changing the conditions of working class.
That the minimum wage is more of a wage ceiling than it's a wage floor.
Oh, say more.
Well, that it actually artificially suppresses wages. It doesn't it can look like it artificially inflates wages, and certainly there's that criticism, and that's partially true, but it's actually more true that what it does is that it sets a wage ceiling. So it actually, minimum wage laws tend to suppress wages.
Okay, but I need to understand. I don't see how that happens. Can you?
So in Germany, there is no minimum wage. There is none, and the socialists have been against it, and the right has tried to implement it, and yet Germany has among the highest wages in the world.
But what is it about the minimum, setting a minimum for wages that would, in a dialectical way, lead capitalists to
it means that they don't have to compete for workers by paying higher wages,
because the workers are
because there's a minimum, because there's a kind of an agreed upon, so like who earns a minimum wage? Like
service sector workers,
service, retail, right? Young people, of course, like McDonald's workers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
waiters, they get tips to offset the.
They get an even lower minimum wage. So you know
Right.
that the minimum wage for them is even lower because they're expected to get tips. So that's even worse, right?
Right.
Well, let's say the people who actually get the minimum wage as opposed to the suppressed minimum wage of waiters. And you know, there's always been a tiered workforce. There's always been illegal labor, but in the United States, obviously, illegal labor is a much higher component than in Germany, let's say. Although in Germany, in the last 50 years, it's actually grown a great deal.
Yeah.
And so, you know, Germany is not what it once was, right? So there's, you know, they take advantage of young people and also immigrants, and, you know, they illegally suppress wages in ways that they can kind of get away with, just like here, except it's on a bigger scale here, and there are regional disparities in the United States. And so, but it basically says that this is an agreed upon maximum for workers of a certain level, and that
okay,
and that impacts the rest of the labor market accordingly, right?
Because, yeah. So okay, so like if I'm a McDonald's, you know, McDonald's has to pay all its workers behind the counter or in the kitchen minimum wage.
Yep.
So that becomes the most anyone in that kind of
field
industry
in any
will be paid unless they get a promotion or something like that.
Right.
And so that sets a ceiling for an entry level position in that sector.
Right.
So that means that you know, if I'm at Burgerville,
right,
I won't pay more
for
these people because because that sets some sort of, it's not a formal, there's nothing limiting me by law from paying more.
No, but it is de facto, and it's also understood that way, by the way. So it's like, you know, it's industry standards, you know, and it's part of the cartelization of the economy, you know, or monopoly capital, you know. So like very old ideas, you know, that can be problematic, but I use the definitions from longer ago. So when I say monopoly capital, I do not mean Brown and Sweezy, because they're crazy Stalinists. And of course, they're precisely fudging the old Marxist idea of monopoly capital. Right? I mean, there's a reason to my madness, we might say, which is to say that I do want to wrest all of these categories away from the pseudo-Marxism of the last 100 years. You know, since Marxists have started fudging things basically in the Great Depression era, in the Stalinist era, but in the FDR era, in the Popular Front era, in the New Deal era, they've fudged. And I'm interested in what was meant before that fudging started to happen, because that fudging has been extremely obfuscating and has really confused things. There are many like category errors involved. You know, so I mentioned like Adolf Reed will use something like the social wage as a concept. And I feel like this is not, you know, and yes, you could say, oh, well, capitalism has changed since Marx's time or since Rosa Luxemburg's time or since Lenin's time. Sure. But maybe not so much as to justify this kind of conceptual slippage and fudging.
Right. Yeah. I totally agree with you there. But you know, let's continue on in the parrot room. I'll send you another link in just a few minutes. But this was a great first half, and I hope everyone appreciates the new CutroneZone. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.